Hello, everyone. Today we have a very special guest from Australia, Joe Lauria, a very experienced journalist and editor-in-chief of Consortium News. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I want to start with your, let's say, personal memories. In back 2023, you wrote about your personal memories of Bill Ellsberg, who risked his freedom to leak the Pentagon Papers.
Yes.
And of course, we know the Assange case and the Snowden case, and you are following these cases also very closely, as I know. And my question is, how do you view the conflict between freedom of speech and national security? I mean, drawing from these cases, do you believe leaking classified documents can be justified in the public interest, etc.? Because today also the public is discussing these topics all over the world.
I absolutely think it's right to leak classified information, particularly if it's going to end a war, an unjust war. That's what Daniel Ellsberg was trying to do by leaking the Pentagon Papers. And this idea of national security is very often, particularly in the United States, has been used as a kind of a canard. It's not true. It's a way to protect the interests of powerful people who got themselves mixed up in a horrible war like in Vietnam. And they refused to end that war, even though they were losing the war. And they knew that. That's what the Pentagon Papers was all about. The government study that was supposed to be secret, that Dan Ellsberg was taking part in, showed that the U.S. knew they were losing that war for years. But politicians kept telling, and generals kept telling the American public and the world that they were going to win. They were still going to win. So many, many people were dying, mostly Vietnamese, but also American soldiers, in vain, because they knew eventually they were going to have to get out of this war. But it was too difficult for them politically to back out of the war, because they would show to be failures, not only losers militarily, but politically, to continue this war based on lies that the war was going to be won. And I think we see a similar thing in Ukraine right now, frankly, let alone what's going on in Gaza, which is much, much worse than just lying about winning a war, which I also think Netanyahu is doing. They're not interested in winning and beating Hamas, not now anyway, because then they need to get all the people out of there. That's their stated open aim right now. So they don't want to win that war. But yes, I think that a whistleblower or someone who has possession of these documents, like Ellsberg did, like Chelsea Manning did about the war in Iraq, and to find a newspaper or an online publisher like WikiLeaks to publish these documents, to turn the public away against the government, based on the truth, not on just a political argument, but on the facts that are being withheld from the public. You absolutely have a right to do that. The Assange case was particularly dangerous because they went after a publisher. Now, in the U.S., we have a First Amendment, and that allows you to publish any material, basically, under the First Amendment. But the Espionage Act conflicts with that First Amendment because it says that any person who has unauthorized possession of defense or classified information is in violation of the Espionage Act. Now, Assange was a publisher, so he had First Amendment protection right. But he also was violating technically the Espionage Act. So that act has to change. In fact, that's what he pled guilty to, why he became free, because he said, yes, I broke that law, but I don't believe the law is just. I believed I was protected by the First Amendment. That's why I published the documents. So just again, a government employee who signs a non-disclosure agreement, as you do in all the intelligence agencies, that by law, they're not allowed to give the information up, whether that be the U.S. Espionage Act, the British Official Secrets Act, or I'm sure in Turkey they have. I know there was a big case because I'm friends with one of the journalists who, Yasemin Çongar, is a friend of mine who I knew in Washington 30 years ago in the 1990s. I know she got caught up in that. So this is a really serious issue, and we're living in a time of great repression, not just about classified information, but about any kind of information that goes against powerful interests. They're shutting down people's speech, particularly in social media, The government is using private companies to shut down the voices of people who are critical of Israel in particular right now and what's going on in Gaza. And this is even more serious than Daniel Ellsberg, because it involves hundreds, maybe thousands of people, students on the campuses who are speaking out. That Turkish woman who was arrested in Massachusetts, a student who wrote an opinion article along with 4 other names. She was only one name on the article, and she was arrested.
How do you assess these things now? I mean, it's very moving, of course, what we are telling, and we are following it. When you compare it with the years ago or decades ago, did you see something similar like that? I mean, regarding the freedom of speech in the United States?
Now, this is much worse. I'll give you a quick example about how it was better. It was never great. First Amendment's always been violated. At least it's written down. Many other countries don't have an amendment like that, a Bill of Rights, but it's violated in the U.S. And we'll give you an example of how bad it's gotten now. 50 years ago, in 1970s, I can't remember the exact word, 69. I can't remember the year, unfortunately, right now. But there was a journalist named Seymour Hersh, and he was given classified information, or he was told about this attack in My Lai, which is a village in Vietnam, where American soldiers killed dozens of innocent women and children and old men in a village. It was one of many, many massacres like that. But the American public didn't know about this. This was not in the newspapers. So a whistleblower went to Congress and then went to this journalist and gave the information. The information was published, became a big scandal. They actually arrested one soldier and put him on trial, but he got out after a year or two. So, but something happened. If you compare that My Lai massacre to the massacre that we see on the video that was given by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks called Collateral Murder, these U.S. war helicopters firing at civilians on a street in Baghdad and killing a number of them, that we see this awful film. What happened in that instance? In the My Lai 1960s incident, the whistleblower was listened to by Congress and by the press, and nothing happened to that whistleblower. Whereas in the Chelsea Manning one, she went to jail for giving up that information. In My Lai, the journalist Seymour Hersh got a job at the New York Times and won a Pulitzer Prize for that reporting. In the story of the collateral murder, we're talking about 2 U.S. military massacres of civilians, one in Vietnam and one in Iraq. And then the journalist in the Baghdad story, Julian Assange, also went to jail. And nobody was convicted of the soldiers that did the Baghdad one, whereas at least there was one soldier, Lieutenant Calley, who was incarcerated. So look at it. The whistleblower is free in Vietnam, goes to jail in Iraq. The journalist is free and gets awards in Vietnam, and in the Baghdad instance, he goes to jail. At least one soldier goes to prison in Vietnam. Nobody's even prosecuted. So this just shows you 50 years later how the U.S. system and the culture has changed much for the worse. But as I said, the censorship that's going on, and it is censorship because government is involved using private companies to shut down people's speech in Twitter, on Facebook. And we all know this for sure now. And this is because people have more voice than they ever did because of social media. Those elite, powerful interests are feeling more and more under threat by the populace now, not by a good media like that brought down Nixon with Watergate. But we're talking about average people now having a voice they never had before. So there's an overdrive of trying to shut voices down. And we're not talking about the Soviet Union. We're not talking about China. We're talking about the United States. It's supposed to be this beacon of democracy.
Well, my next question is a general one, of course, related to these things, what you are telling about. Drawing from your book, A Political Odyssey, how would you explain America's persistent interventionism since World War II? I mean, since decades, we speak about the military-industrial complex. As I know from, since Eisenhower, right? I mean, what forces this complex's reliance on perpetual war? And can this cycle be broken?
Big question. First of all, I think U.S. inventionism began with the very first day the United States existed in 1789, really, or 1787, when they beat the British. And what do I mean by that is one of the things that Britain did was to pass a law in the Parliament saying that the colonists in North America could not go beyond the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, to conquer Native American land. I don't think that a lot of American colonists liked that. That was one reason, I believe, for the revolt. There were many. That wasn't the main one. So once the war was won and America was a country, an independent country, it began its war of extermination against the native population. That was a war of expansion, of territorial expansion, of interventions that you just described. So this goes way back to the beginning. Of course, it became a worldwide phenomenon in 1898 when the declining, decrepit Spanish Empire that was on its end was finished by the rising American Empire when they beat the Spanish in the Philippines, in Guam, in Puerto Rico, and they even attacked in Cuba. So this was the expansion of the U.S. globally. But even before that, I forgot to mention the Mexican War, which all the states, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, they're all part of Mexico. The U.S. took that from Mexico. They beat Mexico in the war. So these were all territorial. This never stopped. But after the Second World War, during the World War, a phenomenon changed, and I just do describe that in that book that you mentioned that I wrote with the late Senator Mike Gravel. After every war in U.S. history, many companies that made sewing machines, for example, and then made weapons for the war, when the war ended, they went back to making sewing machines. A military that raised like 1 million soldiers in terms of, even in the American Civil War, after the war, these guys went back to the farm. So there was never a huge army in the U.S. or a permanent military industry. But after the Second World War ended, because of the Depression in the 1930s, the economic depression was ended for the most part because of the war. The war industry got the U.S. out of the Depression and became the most powerful manufacturing force in the world. Certainly not now. Trump's trying to go back to that, but that's probably never going to happen. And because of this great powerhouse of industry based solely on the war, when the war ended, there was fear the Depression would return. So there was an impetus to keep the military industry going. And it coincided with U.S. expansion around the world. They were left with bases in the Pacific, in Asia, all throughout the world. And this was now a global empire with the rest of the world destroyed. Only the U.S. was untouched, really, by this war. So this is the beginning of America's global empire and a permanent military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it. And we're still living in this. And how will this end? Like all empires end, gradually, going forward, going back, but losing, collapsing, not on by its own will, but because of the inevitability of all empires ending. And we see now the BRICS nations coalescing together as a force, a counterweight to U.S. imperial might. And this is really the beginnings of the end. And I think you could see Trump is a president who went in his inauguration speech in January, just a few months ago, he talked about the great American McKinley. This was the president during the war against the Spanish Empire, as I was describing. So he wants to revive the empire. He wants to save the empire with his tariffs. He wants to bring back in manufacturing power that the United States had at the end of the Second World War in the 1950s. This is this is not going to happen. I think it's kind of a sick dream of Trump. And this is what he's representing, those forces where the U.S. realizes that the days are numbered of their world dominance. And like all the European empires, they have to realize they're no longer a great power, and they better turn their attention internally to their domestic issues. We'll see when the European empires ended, they started a national health insurance program. They started a social democratic system. So they spent their money on their own people. That is what has to happen in the United States. We don't see any signs of it happening, but I think inevitably it will. And that's where we're at in the moment of history, in my view.
Okay, let's come to today. I'm curious about your answer, really, to the next question. Trump and the let's say the MAGA movement have repeatedly promised to dismantle the deep state, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think? Can Trump realistically break the influence of the military-industrial complex? I mean, he said this by himself. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, you're talking about Devi Detlu. What is the Turkish word for deep state? So
derin devlet.
Yes. So this is of Turkish origin. This, I studied a lot about that there again on the whole thing many years ago. I was actually, to tell your audience, I was the Wall Street Journal reporter that interviewed Fethullah Gulen in that article that created enormous problems with Erdogan. So look, the deep state, most people, first of all, the deep state denies there's a deep state. Okay. They have put out, the propaganda that this is a joke, that there's a deep state. Who are the people saying that? The deep state. Of course, they don't want to be discovered. They want to stay deep. So the idea that, at least in the US, we're talking about the deep state is progress, right? Whereas other nations knew about their deep states before. Now that it's common knowledge, as you say, MAGA has this idea, but not just MAGA, that behind the elected government are unelected bureaucrats, particularly in the intelligence agencies, that have enormous power. And I think that after the Second World War ended, that moment when Truman started the National Security State with the National Security Act that created the Pentagon and created the National Security Council and created the CIA in 1948, and in 1950 the National Security Agency that wasn't even known about for 30 years. It's that secret. So we know that it exists. They certainly worked, and whether you like Trump or not, and he's certainly somebody to criticize, you cannot deny. Now, when we look back at the Russiagate scandal, which was a complete fake story made up by the Clinton campaign against Trump, and this is very common in American politics and in all politics, I would imagine, to make up false stories about your opponent and try to get it in the newspaper. It's called opposition research. It happens all the time. But these false stories about Trump, the FBI worried them that he would not be a good face for empire, that he would be a complete loose cannon, a wild card, a guy who could say one thing one day, and he is. The guy is somebody who defies rational. It's impossible to really understand what he's going to do next. So the FBI was worried about that, but also he could go after them. They didn't know what they were getting with this guy. And he also stirred up the population, whereas that's how he won, because the Democrats, Hillary Clinton, had total arrogance towards average Americans, where Trump, a billionaire, pretended anyway that he was going to help the average American, and that's why he's twice won elections. And so the deep state got involved, the FBI got involved in a lie again. So he was a personal victim of the FBI in particular, in that whole Russiagate scenario. So he wants to do damage to them. And he hired Kash Patel, an Indian American, to be the FBI director. And they have released some files on the JFK assassination, which is a big part of the deep state. Was the CIA involved in the assassination of John Kennedy? And he has released those. So there are signs of this. And Kash Patel says he wants to shut down the FBI headquarters in Washington and just make it a field office and put that money into law enforcement around the country. If he actually does that, that's a sign of taking down the entrenched bureaucracy in Washington of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That would be a positive sign. So I can't answer the question because nobody knows for sure. I just think that they will find a way to survive. And when Trump is gone, whatever damage is done, they will probably reconstitute that. Unless there's fundamental change, I don't see how the intelligence agencies will lose the unbelievable power that they have to determine foreign policy and even domestic policy. So it's a very crucial and critical moment in U.S. history in that regard.
Because just let me add only one point. The other theory is, the opinion of other people is, Trump is struggling against these forces, but at the end of the day, Trump and his team, they will create their own deep state. This is another theory.
Yes.
But
yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it will change. It'll be one that's controlled by Trump rather than by the Democrats. So, but even that would be different because it's a kind of a nonpartisan force right now. It's always there, no matter who the president is, and no matter who controls Congress. Look at this incident from about 10 years ago when there was a torture report that the Senate wanted to declassify. And we found out this was the torture after the invasion of Iraq, right after 9/11, the various torture sites that the U.S. set up around the world where they were sending people to be tortured. These black sites. And the Senate wanted this report declassified because obviously it's against international and U.S. law to torture people. As Obama said, we tortured folks. So he admitted it. But this report, the CIA spied on, went into the computers of members of Congress, of the Senate, to try to stop them from doing this. And that became known as well. That's how powerful they are. They openly spied on members of the Senate. They're not supposed to act as CIA inside U.S. at all. It's against the charter of the CIA. They're only supposed to act outside the U.S. So they not only acted in the U.S., but they spied on elected U.S. senators to stop them from publishing this torture report, which revealed, of course, their role in torture of the CIA. So it just shows you how powerful they are. But you're quite right. I think that whatever damage is done, he's going to have, I mean, Trump is somebody very hard to define and to describe because we've never seen anything like Trump. So he is operating in a way where he's destroying a good part of the bureaucracy by firing all these people, shutting down agencies, and sort of running this thing from the seat of his pants, we say in the U.S., by just every day kind of ad hoc making decisions. So whether he needs a deep state behind him to do that or not is not clear to me. But he has his ambitions, like to take over Greenland and won that. So will he need intelligence, a deep state to help him do that? He certainly would need the military if that's the option he wants to take. It's a good question. Would he create his own deep state? Very possible.
The question about the deep state was about Trump administration's domestic politics. Let's look to the foreign policy. How realistic are the evaluations that this Trump administration would actually end U.S. involvement in foreign wars? Does Trump represent a shift towards, a lot of people are talking about realistic or let's say realist foreign policy, especially given reports that he is distancing himself from the neocons?
Well, he's not. That's the problem. I mean, he doesn't have someone as bad as John Bolton in his administration this time, who was an arch neocon, or Mike Pompeo, another one. But he has Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State, and he persists with this Keith Kellogg, this general, as his envoy, one of his envoys on Ukraine. And why? He was supposed to, I thought we heard he'd fired him and we demoted him, but now he's back again. So Trump makes nice noises. He says good things. He has the right instincts, it seems like, his non-interventionist viewpoint, which there's a very strong part of that in the United States, in the libertarianism that has gained influence in the last years. And Trump seems to have part of his libertarian views about non-intervention. He says he doesn't like wars and all that. He wants to end the Ukraine war. Okay. Does he understand the root causes of the Ukraine war? This is what Vladimir Putin told him on Monday at their 2-hour phone conversation. The war cannot end unless the root causes are addressed. Nobody in America knows what the root causes are because the mainstream media won't talk about the root causes. They did at the beginning in 2014, the beginning of this crisis, with the unconstitutional change of government in Ukraine, backed by the United States, but the role of neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. All the mainstream media in the US, in Britain, the BBC, they did big articles and video reports about the role of the neo-Nazis, how much they were not large and they don't get seats in the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, but they have extra parliamentary influence way outside the numbers that they are. They have enormous role, and they all reported that. Now that's gone. You can't mention the role of the neo-Nazis, the Azov battalion, and etc. And you don't talk about the fact that the democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, certified by the OSCE, was overthrown violently in February 2014. So that is like excised away, airbrushed out of the story. And if you want to tell that story, this is what Consortium News does. Essentially, it's report what is taken out of the mainstream media. Those root causes. That is, we report, and we have gotten rating. We've gotten companies coming after us to shut us up, to try to call us Russian propagandists and all this, because we're talking about what happened, the coup, the Nazis, etc. Now, you know, Russia presented treaties to NATO and the United States in December 2021, saying if you remove your troops, NATO troops from the former Warsaw Pact countries, take those missiles out of Romania and Poland that are like 6 minutes away from Moscow, they could have nuclear warheads on them, you know, and this is what if you don't negotiate that, we will take technical military, we can invade Ukraine. And that invasion by Russia was an intervention in a war that was going on for 8 years. That was started by Ukraine with U.S. backing. Trump said that. Everybody yelled at him. Ukraine didn't start. Ukraine with the United States started the war in 2014. It's just a fact. You can deny that fact. You can erase that fact. Does Trump understand this? I don't know. I don't think he does. He spent 2 hours with Putin. He's talked to Putin before. Witkoff, his envoy, has gone to see Putin several times. I'm sure the Russians are telling these things, what I just mentioned. There are a few of them. There are other causes. Till they're blue in the face. They've been objecting to NATO expansion for 30 years. Yeltsin objected to Nelson, not just Putin. Yeltsin, their puppet in Moscow, was against NATO expansion. So will Trump end that war in Ukraine? He has to understand the root causes. And he's got to get Ukraine to realize that the only way they have a chance of winning is if NATO directly gets involved fighting Russia, and NATO leaders know that that could lead to a nuclear annihilation. So that will not happen. Therefore, Ukraine cannot win. They have lost the war, and the sooner they give up, and they have to give up territory, the better deal they will get. But they persist in fighting. Trump is ineffectual. He can't force this end of war. He should be able to, because he has the power over Ukrainian government to shut off the arms, shut off the intelligence, shut off the money. The entire Ukrainian government has been run by the U.S. taxpayer for 8 years now. So he can end that war. He's not doing it. Number two, Gaza is the worst. This man is a war criminal of the worst kind. He's so stupid. He thinks that Gaza is a neighborhood in New York City that's full of crime, because he's from New York City, as I am, from Queens. He talks about people getting knifed, getting killed and mugged and stabbed with knives in Gaza. That's what, not that they have 2,000-pound bombs being dropped on their tents, that they're being told to move here and then they're bombed there, that they're being starved. He's talking about they're in knife fights, and he wants to help the poor people of Gaza by moving them out and building new houses and ethnically cleansing Gaza. So you're telling me he wants to end wars? He's facilitating the worst crimes that we've seen in decades. So he's full of it. He's not following his non-interventionist rhetoric. Why? Because he's out of his mind. I don't know. He believes the last person he spoke to, it seems like, is this what he repeats. He's all over the place, and he still has neocons in his administration. He needs the realists there. He needs to listen to them. He has to listen to his own instincts, but he doesn't. He doesn't.
Right at that point, my last question for you. It's about the Middle East. You are following and covering since years very closely the region, and you, of course, you know very well the American perspective. So, do you understand Trump's Middle East strategy? I mean, in the region, the balances are shifting. You know, it's incredible. Assad's fall and the genocide in Gaza, and incredible things are happening. Israel's historic aggression, etc. Do you have a clear understanding what Trump's strategy is in the Middle East?
Yeah, to get a free airplane from Qatar, and to get real estate deals set up when he leaves office in Gaza and elsewhere. And a tower is apparently going to be built in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or something. I mean, this is what his Middle East strategy is. He doesn't understand the Middle East. He only understands real estate deals. That's what he is. He has no clue of the history of the Middle East. He doesn't understand the Palestinian conflict at all. As I just was saying, he thinks Gaza is just a bad neighborhood in New York where people are getting, street crime. This is what he said. This is what it says. So he doesn't have any knowledge of what Western, European, especially British and French first intervention in the Middle East meant. The end of the Ottoman Empire and the rule by Britain and France. How Lebanon and Syria came about. The Sykes-Picot Accord. He doesn't know any of this. And then how the U.S. after the 1956 Suez Crisis basically took over from Britain in the rule in their empire worldwide, and in particular in the Middle East, and how the U.S. is back then the state of Israel as a proxy for them to have domination of the region, and how all the Arab governments have sold out the Palestinians now with his Abraham Accord. So he thinks this is bringing peace, but it has brought Gaza, it's brought the genocide basically, and nobody's lifting a finger except the Yemenis to do anything, including your president, who keeps saying nice things, but continues, as far as I know, to send the oil to Israel. So this guy has got no clue about what's happening. It's his own personal enrichment is what really motivates him. He's going to defend Israel because he got $100 million from the Israeli lobby, Miriam Adelson, this woman of a rich donor who died. So his instinct, as all American politicians, is defend Israel no matter what they do. Now we're starting to see a tide turning. More and more people are speaking out against it because Israel has become totally transparent about their genocide and about their ethnic cleansing. They are not making they're not hiding it anymore. They're openly saying, I'm talking about these extremists who are in the government now, who in Israel from years ago were marginalized. The Kahane group, these people, they were not considered, mainstream in Israel. They are now running the country. So they are fulfilling Ben-Gurion's dream of greater Israel that took place gradually and now is really a final solution in Gaza, which is the most horrific thing we're witnessing. And what is Donald Trump doing? Dreaming about a golf course there. This is how sick it is.
Joe, thank you. Joe Lauria was our guest today, the editor-in-chief of the independent media outlet based in the United States, Consortium News. And hopefully see you next time, Joe.
Thank you for having me on. All the best.